Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a question that burns in the mind of every soul who has ever dared peer into the darkness of the 41st millennium. A question that sits at the very heart of everything we know about the Imperium of man, about the Emperor's grand design, and about the galaxy-shattering wars that have defined 10,000 years of suffering and glory. That question is simple to ask, but impossibly difficult to answer. Just how strong are the Primarchs? These are not ordinary men. Well, they are not even ordinary superhumans. A space marine, one of the Emperor's Adeptus Astartes, stands head and shoulders above any mortal warrior. A space marine can shrug off wounds that would kill a platoon of guardsmen. A space marine can punch through ceramite plating, can react faster than the human eye can follow, can fight for days on end without rest. And yet, to a Primarch, a space marine is little more than a child playing at war. But the gap between a normal human and a space marine is vast, almost incomprehensible. But the gap between a space marine and a Primarch is something else entirely. It is the difference between a candle flame and a star. So, settle in. Let the sounds of the world around you grow quiet. Let the hum of distant machinery fade into the background. Because tonight, we are going to walk through 10,000 years of warfare, of legend, of impossible feats and unimaginable power. We are going to examine each of these demigods on their own terms, exploring what makes them terrifying, what makes them beautiful, and what makes them the most dangerous beings the galaxy has ever produced. This is the story of the Primarchs and the staggering, breathtaking, almost incomprehensible scope of their strength. Before we can understand how strong the Primarchs truly are, we need to understand what they are. And to understand what they are, we need to go back, way back. They're back to a time before the Imperium existed, before the Great Crusade burned its way across the stars, before the first space marine ever drew breath. We need to go back to a secret laboratory hidden deep beneath the Himalayan mountains on ancient Terra, where the most ambitious project in the history of the human species was taking shape in silence and shadow. The Emperor of mankind, that impossibly ancient and powerful being who had walked among humanity since its earliest days, had a vision. He saw a galaxy torn apart by war, by alien predators, by the insidious corruption of the warp. He saw humanity scattered across 1,000,000 worlds, divided and vulnerable, each pocket of civilization slowly being ground to dust by the endless horrors of an uncaring universe. And he decided that this would not stand. He would unite humanity under a single banner. He would drive back the darkness. He would build an empire that would endure for eternity. But to do this, he needed generals. Not ordinary generals, not even brilliant ones. He needed beings of such extraordinary capability that they could each command millions of warriors across dozens of star systems simultaneously. He needed leaders who could inspire fanatical devotion through their mere presence, who could process tactical information faster than any cogitator, who could stand on the front lines of the most terrible battles imaginable and not merely survive but triumph. He needed sons. And so the Primarch project was born. In those hidden laboratories beneath the mountains, the Emperor used every tool at his disposal. He drew upon his own genetic template, that impossibly complex strand of post-human DNA that had been refined over millennia of existence. He employed the most advanced genetic engineering techniques that humanity had ever developed. Technologies from the Golden Age that had been lost and forgotten by all but him. And he reached beyond the material world entirely, into the roiling chaos of the warp itself, bargaining with forces that most would not dare to name for the power and knowledge he needed to complete his work. This is a crucial detail that many overlook when discussing the Primarchs. They were not merely genetic constructs. They were not simply the product of superior science. The Emperor traveled to the world of Molech, passing through a hidden warp gate that connected to the realm of the chaos gods themselves. What exactly he did there, what bargains he struck, what knowledge he gained, remains one of the most closely guarded secrets in all of Warhammer lore. But what we do know is that when he returned, he possessed the ability to create beings that existed as much in the warp as they did in the material universe. The Primarchs were forged from the stuff of reality and unreality alike, their bodies shaped by science, but their souls kindled by something far older and far more dangerous. 20 incubation capsules were prepared, and each one containing a developing Primarch, each one marked with arcane glyphs of protection that the Emperor himself had inscribed. 20 sons, each one designed to embody a different aspect of the Emperor's own vast capabilities. One would be the perfect strategist, another would be the ultimate warrior, a third would master the forge, a fourth would command the very fabric of the warp. Each was meant to be a facet of the Emperor's brilliance, as a reflection of one element of his godlike nature made manifest in superhuman flesh. But the Chaos Gods, those ancient and malevolent entities that dwelt within the warp, learned of the Emperor's plans. They understood what these 20 beings would mean for their dominion over mortal souls. They understood that if the Emperor succeeded, if his Primarchs led humanity to unity and enlightenment, the power of chaos would wane. And so they struck. A massive localized warp rift was torn open within the gene vaults themselves, and the 20 incubation capsules were ripped from their moorings and scattered across the galaxy, each one coming to rest on a different world, far from terror and far from the Emperor's protection. This scattering would prove to be one of the most consequential events in the history of the galaxy. Each Primarch grew to maturity on a different world, shaped by vastly different cultures, challenges, and environments. And some were raised by loving families. Others survived alone in the wilderness, fighting for their lives from the moment of their arrival. Some became kings and conquerors. Others became slaves and gladiators. But no matter where they landed, no matter what trials they faced, each Primarch grew into something extraordinary, something that defied explanation, something that made the people around them stare in awe and whisper that the gods themselves had walked among them. And here is where our story truly begins. Because when the Emperor finally found his scattered sons and reunited them with the Space Marine legions that had been created from their genetic templates, the galaxy witnessed the rise of 20 beings whose combined power was enough to reshape the stars themselves. The Great Crusade that followed was the most rapid and successful military campaign in human history, sweeping across the galaxy like a burning tide, or bringing world after world into the fold of the nascent Imperium. And at the head of each conquering fleet stood a Primarch, a being of such sublime and terrible power that entire civilizations would surrender at the mere rumor of their approach. But how strong were they, really? What could these demigods actually do? Those are the questions we are here to answer. And I promise you, by the time we are finished, you will understand why the galaxy trembled at their footsteps. Set the foundation of power. To understand the full scope of a Primarch's strength, we first need to establish a baseline. We need to understand what these beings were capable of before we even begin to discuss the unique talents and abilities that set each one apart from his brothers. Because even at their most basic, even stripped of their individual gifts and legendary weapons, the Primarchs were entities of almost incomprehensible power. Let us start with the physical. A Primarch stood roughly 3 meters tall, towering over even the largest Space Marines the way those Astartes towered over ordinary men. Their bodies were not merely large but impossibly dense, packed with muscle fiber and reinforced bone that made them far heavier and far more durable than their size alone would suggest. Where a Space Marine's enhanced physiology gave him the strength to bend steel bars and shatter concrete with his fists, and a Primarch could do these things without conscious effort, their strength existed on a scale that bordered on the geological. Consider what the lore tells us. Rabut Gilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, who was not even considered among the most physically imposing of his brothers, could punch through the power armor of a traitor Space Marine with his bare hands, not with a power fist, not with a master-crafted weapon, with his naked fist. and he could tear through ceramite plating the way you or I might tear through wet paper. Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders, who was considered the strongest of his brothers in raw physical terms, could flip tanks. Not small vehicles, not light transports, but fully laden battle tanks weighing dozens of tons, tossed aside like a child overturning a toy. Ferrus Manus, the Gorgon of the Iron Hands, once carried an entire mountain range and moved it near an island, as a feat so impossibly vast that it almost defies our ability to conceptualize it. And this was just their strength. Their speed was equally staggering. Primarchs could move faster than sound in short bursts, their bodies accelerating with a violence that would turn a normal human to paste from the G-forces alone. Their reaction times existed on a scale that made even Space Marine reflexes look sluggish by comparison. In combat, they could process and respond to threats with such speed that the world around them seemed to move in slow motion. Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Emperor's Children, was known to move faster than sound could reach him, his blade finding its mark before his opponents could even register that he had moved. Sanguinius, the Great Angel, could launch 6 separate attacks in the span of a single microsecond during his final duel with Horus, and his wings and blade moving with a fury that defied the laws of physics as we understand them. Their durability matched their strength and speed. A Primarch's skin could resist bullets, not metaphorically, not through the use of force fields or protective equipment, but through the sheer physical toughness of their enhanced flesh. Corvus Corax, the Primarch of the Raven Guard, once had bullets bounce off his unarmored skin during the events on Deliverance. Their bones were nearly unbreakable, their organs redundant and self-repairing, their blood filled with enhanced clotting agents and regenerative compounds that could seal wounds in moments. A blow that would kill a Space Marine outright might merely annoy a Primarch. A wound that would fell a company of Astartes might cause a Primarch to flinch. When 2 Primarchs fought each other, the lore describes the clash in terms that sound more like natural disasters than combat. When Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim battled during the Dropsite massacre on Istvan V, their weapons released energies that illuminated the battlefield for hundreds of meters. The novel describes their blows as possessing the strength to defeat armies and topple mountains. This is not poetic exaggeration. In the context of Warhammer lore, Primarchs have been consistently shown performing feats that exist on a scale normally associated with heavy military hardware or geological events. But physical prowess was only one dimension of a Primarch's power. Every single one of them possessed a spark of the warp within their souls, a fragment of the Emperor's own psychic essence that manifested in different ways depending on the individual. For some, like Magnus the Red, this manifested as overwhelming psychic power, the ability to reshape reality with a thought. For others, like Conrad Kersey, it took the form of prophetic visions, glimpses of possible futures that haunted his every waking moment. For still others, like Layman Russ, it expressed itself as an innate resistance to sorcery, a kind of spiritual armor that made him almost impossible to affect through supernatural means. This warp-born nature meant that the Primarchs existed on multiple planes of reality simultaneously. They were physical beings, yes, but they were also psychic entities of enormous significance. Their presence could be felt in the warp itself, great blazing beacons of power that drew the attention of demons and gods alike. Their emotions could influence the morale of entire armies, inspiring superhuman courage or crushing despair depending on their temperament. Their very essence was tied to the fabric of reality in ways that normal beings could never be, which is why their deaths or their corruption had consequences that echoed across the galaxy for millennia. And then there was their intelligence. And each Primarch possessed a mind that operated on a level so far beyond normal human cognition that comparison becomes almost meaningless. They could process information with the speed and precision of advanced cogitators, while simultaneously exercising the kind of creative intuition that no machine could replicate. They could learn new languages in hours, master unfamiliar weapon systems in minutes, and develop military strategies of such complexity and brilliance that the greatest human generals in history would weep to behold them. Robert Guillemot could simultaneously manage the logistics of a galaxy-spanning crusade while personally leading forces in combat, while also governing a sprawling interstellar civilization. The sheer multitasking capacity of a Primarch's mind was enough to make them invaluable even if they had possessed no other abilities at all. Each Primarch also possessed what can only be described as a supernatural charisma, an aura of authority and magnetism that was as much a product of their warp-touched nature as it was of their physical presence. Normal humans who encountered a Primarch often described the experience in religious terms, as if they had been in the presence of a god or an angel. This was not merely psychological, but had a genuine psychic component, an emanation of the Primarch's enormous warp presence that affected the minds and emotions of those around them. It was this quality that allowed the Primarchs to inspire such fanatical loyalty in their legions, loyalty that in many cases would persist for 10,000 years after the Primarchs themselves had disappeared from the galaxy. So this is our baseline. This is what every Primarch was capable of simply by virtue of being a Primarch. Strength sufficient to topple mountains, speed that approached the supersonic, durability that shrugged off weapons fire, intelligence that surpassed the greatest minds in human history, psychic presence that could be felt across the warp, charisma that could inspire or terrify millions. And we have not even begun to discuss what made each of them unique. Because the truly terrifying thing about the Primarchs is not what they shared, but what set them apart. Each one was designed to excel in a different domain, and to embody a different aspect of the Emperor's limitless capabilities. And when we begin to examine those individual strengths, when we look at what the most powerful among them could actually do at the peak of their abilities, the picture that emerges is one that makes even the cosmic horrors of the 41st millennium seem small by comparison. The mightiest warriors, mountains of muscle and fury. When people talk about the strongest Primarchs in terms of sheer physical power, three names consistently rise above the rest: Vulcan, Angron, Lemon Russ. These were the brothers who, in a straight test of brute force and physical ferocity, stood above even their godlike siblings. These were the ones you sent when you needed something not merely defeated, but obliterated, when the problem required not strategy or subtlety, but the raw, overwhelming application of transhuman violence. Let us begin with Vulcan, the Lord of Drakes, the Primarch of the Salamanders, and the being who may well be the single most physically powerful Primarch ever created. Vulcan himself stated it plainly in a conversation with his brother, Conrad Curzy, words that have become legendary among those who study the lore. "Of all of us," he said, "Father made me the strongest. Physically, I have no equal amongst my siblings. In the sparring cages, I used to hold back, especially against you, Conrad." This was not boasting, as this was not the empty bravado of a warrior trying to intimidate an opponent. This was a statement of simple fact from a being who knew exactly what he was capable of and felt no need to exaggerate. Vulcan was born on the volcanic death world of Nocturne, a planet of fire and ash and constant geological upheaval. The people of Nocturne were hardy and resilient, forced by the brutal conditions of their home to develop a culture of incredible physical toughness and communal determination. But even by the standards of Nocturne, Vulcan was something else entirely. Within 3 years of his arrival on the planet, he was already bigger and stronger than any adult man in his community. He became a master blacksmith of extraordinary skill, forging weapons and tools that advanced his people's technology by centuries in a matter of months. He fought off Dark Elder raiders with weapons of his own making, displaying physical prowess that left his fellow Nocturians in awed silence. Or when the Emperor came to Nocturne in disguise, he challenged Vulcan to a contest that would last 8 days. 8 days of tests of strength, endurance, and craftsmanship. They held anvils above their heads for half a day before the contest was called a tie. The sheer physical stamina required for such a feat defies easy description. Imagine holding a massive block of solid metal above your head for 12 straight hours without faltering. Even for a being of Vulcan's power, this required reserves of endurance that bordered on the infinite. But it is Vulcan's feats in combat and crisis that truly reveal the scope of his physical strength. During the Beast Arises series, Vulcan tanked a gravity weapon that had been responsible for the destruction of multiple planets. Let that sink in for a moment. A weapon capable of annihilating entire worlds struck Vulcan, and he survived. He also withstood the concentrated energy of a gas giant's storm, and an amount of kinetic and thermal energy so vast that it dwarfs anything we associate with conventional warfare. He hauled a Stormzord super heavy tank, a vehicle weighing over 300 tons, and moved it through sheer physical effort. His hammer, Dawnbringer, was so massive that no being but a Primarch could hope to lift it, and yet Vulcan wielded it with fluid grace, each swing carrying the force of a demolition charge. But what truly set Vulcan apart from every other Primarch, what elevated him from merely the strongest to something approaching the unkillable, was his nature as a perpetual. Like his father, the Emperor, Vulcan possessed the extraordinary ability of complete cellular regeneration. He could not die, not permanently. No matter what was done to him, no matter how thoroughly his body was destroyed, Vulcan would eventually regenerate and return to life. This was demonstrated in horrifying detail during his captivity at the hands of his brother, Conrad Kersey, the Night Haunter, who took sadistic pleasure in killing Vulcan over and over again in increasingly creative and horrific ways. Kersey cut Vulcan's head off. He ripped out his throat with a fork. He stabbed him through the chest and tore him limb from limb. He had Vulcan eviscerated, shot with hundreds of bolters at close range, left in the venting shaft of a starship's engine, and thrown into the void of space completely naked. Every single time, Vulcan regenerated. Every single time, he came back. The Night Haunter threw everything he had at his brother, every form of death and torture he could conceive, and none of it could make the Lord of Drakes stay dead. During his later confrontation with Magnus the Red in the webway beneath Terra, Vulcan's perpetual nature was pushed to its absolute limits. Magnus tried every conceivable method to permanently kill his brother. He beheaded him with his blade. He suffocated him by turning his lungs to amber. He drained every drop of blood from his body. He immolated him with psychic fire, hot enough to burn reality itself. And every single time, Vulcan regenerated. Every single time, he got back up and continued hammering away at the Crimson King. It was attrition warfare on a cosmic scale, and Vulcan won through the simple, brutal fact that he could not be stopped. Then there is Angron, the Red Angel, the Primarch of the World Eaters, and arguably the most tragic figure in the entire Warhammer universe. To understand Angron's strength, you must first understand his pain, because the two are inseparable. They are woven together like threads in a rope, each one making the other stronger, each one making the other more terrible. Angron landed on the world of Nuceria, a civilized planet ruled by a decadent aristocracy that entertained itself with gladiatorial combat. As the young Primarch was captured by slavers and forced into the fighting pits, where he was subjected to a form of psychosurgery known as the Butcher's Nails. These were archaeotech cortical implants from the dark age of technology, crude neural devices that were hammered into the brain and spine, replacing portions of the cerebral cortex with cybernetic systems designed to artificially boost aggression and pain tolerance to inhuman levels. The nails rewarded rage with spurts of electrochemical pleasure, while deadening the ability to enjoy anything else. They turned their victims into perfect killing machines at the cost of everything that made them human. For a normal gladiator, the Butcher's Nails were devastating. For a Primarch, they were catastrophic. The nails replaced Angron's limbic lobe and insular cortex, the parts of the brain responsible for emotional regulation and self-awareness. Yet the Emperor himself examined the implants and admitted that while he could remove them, the damage was so extensive that doing so would kill Angron. The nails had become part of him, inseparable from the Primarch they had been hammered into. But the nails also did something that their Nucerian creators never intended. They amplified Angron's already tremendous physical capabilities to a level that even his brothers found terrifying. Under the influence of the nails, Zhao Angron became the greatest gladiator Nuceria had ever known, earning the title Lord of the Red Sands. He was unbeaten, undefeated, a hurricane of violence that could not be contained or controlled. When he finally led a slave revolt, his masters sent 5 entire armies to stop him, and even then they could not bring him down. Angron's most famous feat of raw physical strength occurred during the Shadow Crusade, when he and Lorgar led their legions on a campaign of destruction through the Ultramar systems. During one engagement, a Warhound Titan, a massive bipedal war machine standing many meters tall and weighing hundreds of tons, attempted to stomp on Lorgar. Angron caught the Titan's foot with his bare hands. He stopped a Warhound Titan mid-stride through nothing but the raw power of his muscles and his fury. He held it there, straining against the hydraulic systems and fusion reactors of one of the Imperium's most formidable war machines, and he held it. His brothers spoke of him in hushed tones when it came to combat. Alongside Leman Russ and Vulcan, Angron was considered one of the most physically powerful Primarchs, but where Vulcan's strength was controlled and purposeful, and Russ's was wild but directed, Angron's was an uncontrolled inferno, a force of nature that destroyed everything in its path, including, ultimately, himself. The tragedy of Angron is that before the Butcher's Nails, he possessed abilities that none of his brothers shared. There are accounts suggesting that the young Angron could absorb the pain of others, taking their suffering into himself so that his fellow gladiators could sleep peacefully. This suggests a level of psychic empathy that, if properly developed, could have made him one of the most remarkable and compassionate of all the Primarchs. Instead, the nails burned it all away, leaving nothing but rage and the memory of rage, turning one of the Emperor's most promising sons into a weapon that could think only of blood and death. When Angron was eventually transformed into a Daemon Prince of Khorne during the Shadow Crusade, his already terrifying physical power was amplified to levels that defied comprehension. As a Daemon Primarch, Angron became something that existed partially outside the laws of physics. A being of pure wrath given physical form by the blood god's favor. His body grew to monstrous proportions, wreathed in dark energy, and armed with weapons forged in the furnaces of the warp. In this form, he was capable of feats that even his Primarch body could not have achieved, cutting through titans and war machines as if they were made of parchment, his every blow carrying the accumulated fury of a god of war. And then there is Leman Russ, the Wolf King, Primarch of the Space Wolves, and the brother who saw himself as the Emperor's executioner. Russ grew up on Fenris, one of the most brutal death worlds in the Imperium, a planet of towering glaciers, howling blizzards, and predatory fauna that would give us space marine nightmares. Raised by wolves in the truest sense, the young Primarch developed a ferocity and physicality that was remarkable even by the standards of his brothers. Russ was a fighter to his very core. Where some Primarchs preferred strategy or diplomacy, so Russ preferred the direct approach. His fighting style was savage and relentless, a hurricane of blows that combined transhuman speed with an almost animalistic instinct for combat that no amount of training could replicate. He possessed super-enhanced senses that surpassed even those of his brothers, allowing him to track prey across vast distances and detect threats that would be invisible to anyone else. And he possessed a natural immunity to sorcery that made him almost impossible to affect through psychic means, a quality that made him uniquely dangerous to psyker opponents. Russ's combat record is one of the most impressive among all the Primarchs. He killed a Primarch, though the identity and circumstances remain one of the great mysteries of the Imperium's history. He broke Angron's neck in combat during the Night of the Wolf, though the Red Angel's enhanced physiology allowed him to survive the injury. He wrestled with Lionel Johnson for an entire day and night without either combatant gaining the upper hand, a contest of endurance and skill that demonstrated the extraordinary resilience of both warriors. He broke Magnus the Red's back during the burning of Prospero, though the circumstances of that fight remain controversial, as Magnus may have been holding back for reasons of his own. Perhaps most impressively, yet Russ fought Horus himself to something approaching a standstill during the heresy, managing to wound the chaos-empowered Warmaster with the Spear of Russ, a weapon powerful enough to temporarily cleanse Horus of the corruption that had consumed him since Molech. For a brief moment during that fight, Russ saw his brother as he truly was, not a creature of chaos, but Horus Lupercal, the man he had once called brother. But Horus rejected his offer of redemption, and the fight resumed, with Russ eventually being badly mauled by the Warmaster's talon. Russ himself admitted that there were brothers he believed he could not defeat in single combat. He named Sanguinius, Conrad Kurz, and a chaos-empowered Horus as opponents he would struggle to overcome. This was not false modesty, but the honest assessment of a warrior who had spent his entire existence studying the art of killing. That he believed he could defeat every other Primarch in a straight fight speaks volumes about his confidence in his own abilities, and his track record suggests that this confidence was not misplaced. These three, Vulcan, Angron, and Russ, represent the physical apex of what the Primarchs could achieve. Mountains of muscle and fury, each one capable of feats that would make the mightiest heroes of human myth look like children playing in a sandbox. But physical strength, as devastating as it was only one facet of the diamond. The Primarchs who excelled in martial skill and combat finesse were, in many ways, even more terrifying than those who relied on brute force alone. The master duelists, grace, fury, and the art of the kill. If the previous section was about the hammer, this one is about the scalpel, because among the Primarchs, yes, there existed warriors whose combat ability was defined not merely by how hard they could hit, but by how perfectly they could fight. These were the brothers who elevated warfare from butchery to art, who could dance through a battlefield with a grace that belied the devastation they left in their wake. These were the duelists, the blade masters, the warriors who could kill with such precision that their enemies never even realized they were dying until it was far too late. At the pinnacle of this category stood Sanguinius, the great angel, Primarch of the Blood Angels, and a being who was widely regarded as the noblest and most beloved of all the Emperor's sons. Even his brothers, those proud and competitive demigods, spoke of Sanguinius with a reverence that bordered on worship. Horus himself, the brightest star in the Emperor's constellation of suns, once stated that Sanguinius should have been Warmaster in his place, is that the angel was more like their father than any other Primarch. Whether Horus was referring to combat ability, leadership capacity, or the sheer force of personality that Sanguinius radiated like a golden sun remains a matter of debate, but the implication is clear. Among 20 demigods, Sanguinius was the one who came closest to matching the Emperor's own image. Physically, Sanguinius possessed one feature that no other Primarch shared: his wings. Great feathered wings that spanned meters from tip to tip, giving him the ability to fly with a speed and agility that made him nearly untouchable in combat. While his brothers were bound to the earth, Sanguinius could attack from any angle, diving from above with the force of a thunderbolt, or sweeping low across the battlefield with his blade carving through everything in his path. His wings were not decorative, but they were a devastating tactical advantage that transformed every battlefield into a three-dimensional killing field in which the angel held absolute dominion. But it was not merely his wings that made Sanguinius so formidable. He possessed the gift of precognition, the ability to see fragments of the future before they unfolded. This manifested in combat as an almost supernatural ability to anticipate his opponent's moves, reacting to attacks before they were even launched, in positioning himself with perfect precision to exploit weaknesses that others could not see. Combined with his extraordinary speed and agility, this gift made Sanguinius one of the most dangerous combatants in the galaxy, a warrior who could read the flow of battle the way a musician reads a sheet of music. His most famous engagement came during the Siege of Terra, where Sanguinius fought Kabanda, one of the mightiest bloodthirsters in the service of Horn. Kabanda was a creature of immense power, a greater demon of the blood god, whose strength and ferocity were legendary even among demons. Their first encounter on Cygnus Prime had ended badly for Sanguinius, with the demon breaking his legs and triggering a psychic backlash that rendered him comatose. But in their second bout, during the defense of the Eternity Gate, Sanguinius prevailed. He broke the daemon's back with the hilt of his sword, shattering its spine and sending it crashing to the earth. This was not a feat accomplished through raw strength alone. It required perfect timing, superhuman precision, and the courage to close with a creature that could have destroyed entire armies. But Kabanda was not even Sanguinius's most dangerous opponent during that terrible day. After defeating the Bloodthirster, the exhausted and wounded angel faced his own demonic brother Angron, who had been transformed into a demon prince during the heresy. In a climactic airborne battle above the walls of the Imperial Palace, Angron impaled Sanguinius upon his black blade. But Sanguinius, with his dying strength, or perhaps through the sheer force of his will, seized the opportunity to rip out Angron's butcher's nails, causing the demon Primarch's head to explode. Even in the moment of his apparent defeat, Sanguinius turned the tables on one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. And then, wounded and weary beyond imagining, Sanguinius faced Horus. The Warmaster was, by this point, empowered by all four Chaos Gods, his body and soul a vessel for the combined might of Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh. He was arguably the most powerful mortal being in the galaxy, second only to the Emperor himself. Sanguinius knew he could not win. He had seen his own death in his prophetic visions, had known for years that this moment would come. But he faced Horus anyway, because that was who he was, the angel who would not flinch, even in the face of certain death. Horus struck Sanguinius down, but legend holds that it was the crack in Horus's armor created by Sanguinius's final blow that allowed the Emperor to eventually slay the Warmaster. Even in death, the great angel served. Standing alongside Sanguinius in the pantheon of supreme combat masters was Lionel Johnson, the Primarch of the Dark Angels, and a warrior whose skill with a blade was rivaled perhaps only by Horus himself. The Lion, as he was known, grew up alone in the monster-infested forests of Caliban, a death world tainted by its proximity to the Eye of Terror. For a decade, the young Primarch survived alone in the wilderness, fighting and killing creatures of chaos with nothing but his bare hands and whatever weapons he could fashion from the forest itself. As by the time the Knights of the Order found him, he had spent 10 years in an environment that would have killed any normal human in minutes, and he had not merely survived, but thrived. This upbringing forged the Lion into something uniquely dangerous. He was a hunter without equal, possessed of senses so acute that he could detect warp entities by their presence alone. His combat style was precise, economical, and utterly devastating. Each blow calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimum wasted energy. Where Angron fought with berserk fury and Russ with savage aggression, the Lion fought with the cold efficiency of a predator that knew exactly where and how to strike for the kill. The Lion's combat record during the Horus heresy is remarkable.
Look, I have to be real with you for a second. I have spent an embarrassing number of hours reading about these guys. And the one thing that always gets me is how Games Workshop managed to make every single Primarch feel like they could be someone's favorite. Like, you would think with 20 of them, some would just blend together, but they don't. Every one of them has the one moment, that one story beat, where you go, oh, okay, I get it now. For me personally, it was reading about Vulcan getting killed over and over by Curzay and just refusing to stay down. Something about that just hit different. There's something weirdly inspiring about a guy who literally cannot be kept down no matter what the universe throws at him. But anyway, that's just me. Let me know in the comments who your favorite Primarch is and what moment sold you on them. Alright, let's go back to the video.
He fought and bested his brother Conrad Kurz on multiple occasions, once slitting the Night Haunter's throat in single combat, where he hunted Curzy through the bowels of his own flagship for 16 weeks, stalking his brother through the darkness with the patience of the apex predator he was. He was named Lord Protector of Imperium Secundus, a title equivalent to Warmaster, in recognition of his martial prowess and tactical genius. When the lion returned to the 41st millennium after 10,000 years of slumber, he came armed with the Emperor's shield and the sword fealty, and he was immediately thrust into combat against the demon Primarch Angron. This confrontation, 10,000 years in the making, demonstrated that the lion's skill had not diminished one iota during his long sleep. He fought the demon Primarch of Horn to a standstill, matching supernatural fury with supernatural precision, proving that even the most powerful gifts of chaos could be countered by sufficient martial skill and determination. Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Emperor's Children, deserves mention in any discussion of combat mastery, though his story is one of the most tragic in the entire Warhammer canon. Before his corruption by chaos, Fulgrim was the embodiment of martial perfection. He fought with a speed and grace that even his brothers found beautiful to watch, his blade moving with such fluid precision that each stroke seemed like a brush painting on the canvas of battle. He was not the strongest Primarch in raw physical terms, but his agility and technique more than compensated for any deficit in brute force. Fulgrim's fall to Slaanesh twisted these gifts into something monstrous. The Leia Blade, a demon weapon that corrupted him during the conquest of the Leia homeworld, amplified his already considerable abilities while poisoning his soul. It was Fulgrim who struck down Ferrus Manus, his closest brother, during the Dropsite massacre on Istvan V. Though this victory came only after Ferrus hesitated to strike the killing blow against a sibling he still loved. As a demon prince of Slaanesh, Fulgrim became a serpentine creature of immense power, his original beauty corrupted into something alien and horrifying, his combat abilities elevated to superhuman extremes by the favor of the Dark Prince. It was this transformed Fulgrim who would later strike down Guilliman at the Battle of the Sala, his poisoned swords nearly ending the Lord of Ultramar's existence permanently. The Warhawk, Jagatai Khan of the White Scars, also deserves recognition among the master combatants. The Khan was speed incarnate, a warrior who fought with a fluidity and swiftness that even Fulgrim found difficult to match. Raised among the nomadic tribes of Chagoris, a world whose vast steppes bred a culture of lightning-fast cavalry warfare, the Khan embodied the philosophy of the devastating first strike, where he did not believe in protracted combat. He believed in arriving with overwhelming speed, striking with devastating force, and vanishing before the enemy could respond. His combat style reflected this philosophy perfectly, a whirlwind of precise, devastating blows delivered at speeds that pushed even a Primarch's capabilities to their limit. The mind unbound, Magnus the Red, and the power of the warp. We have spoken of strength, we have spoken of speed and skill and the art of the blade. But now we must turn to something altogether different, something that operates on a scale so vast and so fundamentally different from physical combat that comparing the two almost feels unfair. We must speak of psychic power, and to speak of psychic power among the Primarchs is to speak of one name above all others. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, the sorcerer of Prospero, and the most powerful psyker ever to walk the material universe outside of the Emperor himself. As all of the Primarchs possessed a spark of the warp within them, this was a fundamental aspect of their creation, a consequence of whatever bargain the Emperor had struck during his visit to the Warp Gate on Molech. But where most Primarchs expressed this warp-born nature through enhanced physicality, preternatural charisma, or subconscious abilities like precognition or stealth, Magnus expressed it directly. He was a psyker of prodigious, almost limitless power, as a being who could manipulate the very fabric of reality with the force of his will alone. Magnus was unique among his brothers in that he was entirely aware of his own birth and development, conscious from the moment of his creation in the gene vaults beneath the Himalayas. He remembered the scattering that sent him hurtling through the warp to the world of Prospero, a remote colony world whose population happened to include a disproportionate number of psykers. It was the perfect environment for the young Primarch, the one place in the galaxy where his extraordinary psychic gifts would not make him an outcast or a target for persecution. On Prospero, Magnus grew at an extraordinary rate, quickly surpassing his teachers and becoming the preeminent psyker on the planet. He rebuilt cities with his powers, purged alien threats, and established vast libraries filled with knowledge about the warp, or the Great Ocean, as the Prosperans called it. But he peered into the Imperium with an intensity and depth that no one else dared, seeking to understand its nature, to catalogue its secrets, to master its power. And in doing so, he became something that existed as much in the warp as in the material universe. His physical form, a mere reflection of a consciousness that spanned dimensions. The scope of Magnus's psychic abilities defies easy description. He could unmake solid matter with a gesture. He could wrap himself in fire that followed in his wake like a burning cloak. He could bring entire armies of mortals to their knees, weeping as their worst nightmares danced before their eyes. He could see the paths of the future, reading the timeline of events as clearly as you or I might read a book. No artifice or subtlety of warcraft could deceive him, for the Crimson King's single cyclopean eye could see through all illusions and penetrate all disguises. In battle, Magnus fought like a mythical god made flesh. His very presence warped reality around him, the laws of physics bending and distorting in response to the enormous psychic energy that poured from his form. He could vaporize enemies with bolts of pure warp energy, could telekinetically crush war machines the way a child might crush a tin can, could project his consciousness across thousands of kilometers to communicate with allies or assault enemies on the psychic plane. He could summon storms of psychic fire that would reduce entire formations to ash, could erect barriers of pure willpower that could withstand orbital bombardment, could reach into the minds of his enemies and reshape their thoughts and memories to suit his purposes. The feats attributed to Magnus in the lore are staggering. He is described as being capable of vaporizing titans that completely dwarfed warlord-class war engines, machines made of materials 100 times harder than stone, yet his attacks barely scratched another Primarch. This speaks to a fascinating aspect of Primarch combat. These beings existed on a level where the power that could destroy a city block-sized war machine was merely a nuisance when directed at one of their siblings. The scale of power involved is almost incomprehensible. Magnus is described as being stronger than all of his followers combined, and a small portion of those followers were capable of holding off orbital bombardment that was vaporizing mountains. If we follow this chain of scaling, the implications for Magnus's individual power are staggering. He existed on a tier of psychic might that placed him in a category essentially by himself, second only to the Emperor in the sheer breadth and depth of his sorcerous capabilities. When Magnus broke through the Imperial webway in his misguided attempt to warn the Emperor of Horus's treachery, the psychic energy he unleashed tore a hole in the carefully constructed barrier that the Emperor had been maintaining to protect humanity from the demons of the warp. This single act of reckless power, performed across interstellar distances and through layers of psychic shielding that the Emperor himself had erected, destroyed the Webway project, doomed humanity's best hope for independence from the warp, and allowed demons to pour into the tunnels beneath the Imperial Palace. The fact that Magnus could accomplish this feat at all, even unintentionally, speaks to a level of psychic power that borders on the divine. After his transformation into a demon prince of Tzeentch, Magnus's already formidable powers were elevated to truly cosmic proportions. As the chosen scion of the god of change, and he gained access to sorcerous abilities that allowed him to manipulate reality on a scale that threatened entire star systems. He could project his consciousness across the galaxy, could manifest warp storms that consumed entire fleets, could perform rituals that weakened the Emperor's own psychic defenses on Terra. During the Siege of Terra, Magnus's psychic might was committed to sapping the Emperor's remaining strength. A psychic duel of unimaginable scale fought across dimensions while the physical battle raged above. When Demon Primarch Magnus confronted Robut Guilliman on Luna in the 41st Millennium, the Crimson King's psychic abilities nearly killed the Lord of Ultramar. Despite Guilliman wielding the Emperor's own sword, a weapon imbued with the master of mankind's psychic essence, Magnus's sorcerous attacks brought the Primarch of the Ultramarines within a hair's breadth of death. Only the intervention of the Sisters of Silence, whose blank nature nullified Magnus's psychic powers, allowed Guilliman to turn the tide and drive his brother back through the warp gate. This encounter perfectly illustrates both the terrifying potential and the specific vulnerabilities of psychic-based combat. Magnus was arguably the single most dangerous Primarch on the battlefield when his powers were operating at full capacity, but take those powers away, strip the warp from his grasp, and he became merely another Primarch, still formidable, but no longer operating on a plane above his brothers. It was a vulnerability that his enemies exploited whenever possible, and one that Magnus himself was keenly aware of, which is why he surrounded himself with Thousand Sun sorcerers, whose collective psychic might could amplify his own power to even greater heights. But Magnus's story also illustrates something deeper about the nature of the Primarch's power. It was never merely physical, never merely psychic, never merely strategic. Each Primarch existed as a nexus of abilities that reinforced and amplified each other. Magnus's psychic might made him a devastating combatant, but it was his intelligence that allowed him to wield that power with precision. His strategic brilliance was enhanced by his ability to see the future, which in turn was a product of his psychic gifts. And underneath it all was the fundamental truth that he was a Primarch, a being forged from the Emperor's own essence and the power of the warp, a creature for whom the ordinary rules of reality were merely suggestions. The War Master and his shadow, Horus Lupercal. No discussion of Primarch power can be complete without addressing the elephant in the room, the one brother who was elevated above all others, the one who came closest to destroying everything the Emperor had built, the one whose name became synonymous with treachery and betrayal on a galactic scale, the Horus Lupercal, the War Master, the brightest star, the greatest traitor. Before his fall to chaos, Horus was widely considered the most well-rounded and capable of all the Primarchs. He was not the strongest, that title belonged to Vulcan. He was not the most skilled warrior, that honor was contested between Sanguinius, the Lion, and arguably Russ. He was not the greatest psyker, that distinction belonged exclusively to Magnus. He was not even the greatest strategist, though he was certainly among the best, as Guilliman and the Lion could both claim superiority in that domain. But Horus was the only Primarch who excelled in all of these areas simultaneously. He was a true jack of all trades and master of nearly all of them. His physical prowess was extraordinary, his tactical acumen was superb, his charisma was unmatched, save perhaps by the Emperor himself, and his ability to read people, to understand their motivations and manipulate their emotions. It was so refined that it bordered on a psychic gift in its own right. Horus could make friends with almost anyone. He could inspire loyalty in the most jaded and cynical of warriors. He could see the potential in every person he met and knew exactly how to bring it out, whether through encouragement, challenge, or the strategic application of praise and criticism. It was these qualities that led the Emperor to name Horus as War Master, the supreme commander of the Great Crusade. This was not merely a military title. It made Horus the second most powerful being in the Imperium, subordinate only to the Emperor himself. Every Space Marine Legion, every Imperial Army regiment, every fleet and fortress and planetary governor answered to Horus. The weight of this responsibility would have crushed a lesser being, but Horus bore it with apparent ease, prosecuting the Great Crusade with a speed and efficiency that even his most accomplished brothers could not match. In combat, yet Horus was devastatingly effective. His fighting style combined raw power with tactical intelligence, every blow calculated not merely to damage, but to control the flow of the engagement. He wielded two legendary weapons, the Talon of Horus, a massive lightning claw that could tear through the thickest armor, and Worldbreaker, a colossal mace whose strikes carried the force of a demolition charge. Together, these weapons made Horus a nightmare in close combat, and capable of overwhelming even the most skilled opponents through the sheer variety and unpredictability of his attacks. But it was after his fall to chaos that Horus's power truly reached its terrifying zenith. On the planet Davin, through the machinations of the first chaplain Erebus of the Wordbearers, Horus was exposed to the power of the warp. He was shown visions of the future, is carefully selected and deliberately distorted by the Chaos Gods to convince him that the Emperor was a tyrant who intended to ascend to godhood at the expense of his sons. These visions, combined with Horus's existing resentment over the Emperor's withdrawal from the Great Crusade and his perceived abandonment of his sons, were enough to turn the most loyal of the Primarchs against his father. What followed was the Horus heresy, the most devastating civil war in human history, a conflict that consumed millions of worlds, killed trillions of souls, and shattered the Emperor's dream of a united humanity forever. But what concerns us here is not the political or strategic dimensions of the heresy, but the question of how powerful Horus became once the Chaos Gods began to pour their favor into him. The answer is more powerful than almost anything else in the galaxy. By the time of the Siege of Terra, Horus was functioning as a vessel for the combined might of all four Chaos Gods. Khorne, the Blood God, gave him supernatural strength and fury. Tzeentch, the Changer of Ways, gave him sorcerous power and prophetic insight. Nurgle, the Plague Lord, gave him inhuman resilience and the ability to endure any wound. Slaanesh, the Dark Prince, gave him speed and reflexes that exceeded even a Primarch's natural capabilities. Together, these blessings made Horus something that existed on the boundary between mortal and divine, a being of such extraordinary power that even his Primarch brothers could not stand against him. The fight against Leman Russ demonstrated this vividly. Russ, one of the most formidable combatants among the Primarchs, fought Horus with everything he had and was ultimately overpowered. He managed to wound the War Master with the Spear of Russ, temporarily cleansing him of his chaos corruption. But when Horus rejected redemption and the fight resumed, Russ was badly mauled. The Wolf King was left so severely injured that he would eventually withdraw from the Imperium entirely, disappearing into the Eye of Terror on a mysterious quest whose nature remains unknown. During the Siege of Terror itself, Horus's form had become something barely recognizable as human. The Chaos Gods were pouring so much psychic energy into him that his body was beginning to break down. In shifting between different states, his pure Primarch form flickering between the noble Warmaster he had once been and a maw of pure chaotic energy that consumed everything it touched. By the time the Emperor teleported aboard the Vengeful Spirit for their final confrontation, Horus had essentially become a gateway for the power of all four Chaos Gods. A mortal shell containing an infinity of warp energy that burned like a star threatening to go supernova. But what happened aboard the Vengeful Spirit during that final confrontation is the most important event in the history of the Imperium, and the accounts we have of it are fragmentary and often contradictory. What we know is that Sanguinius faced Horus first and was slain, though not before leaving a crack in the Warmaster's armor. What we know is that the Emperor faced his favored son and was grievously wounded, reduced to a state that required his internment upon the Golden Throne for the next 10,000 years. And what we know is that the Emperor ultimately destroyed Horus utterly, not merely killing his body, but annihilating his soul so completely that even the Chaos Gods could not resurrect him. The scale of power involved in this confrontation defies our ability to comprehend it. Two beings, each wielding power sufficient to reshape the destiny of the entire galaxy, clashing aboard a single ship while the fate of all humanity hung in the balance. It was the single greatest concentration of power ever witnessed in the history of the material universe, a battle fought simultaneously on the physical plane, the psychic plane, and the spiritual plane, its consequences echoing across time and space for 10,000 years and counting. And at the heart of it all was Horus, the War Master, the chosen of chaos, and the being who came within a hair's breadth of destroying everything the Emperor had built, not because he was the strongest or the smartest or the most skilled, but because he was the most complete. Horus's true power lay not in any single ability, but in the totality of his capabilities, the way every aspect of his nature reinforced every other aspect, creating a whole that was infinitely greater than the sum of its parts. In this sense, Horus was perhaps the most dangerous of all the Primarchs, and because his power had no single point of failure, no weakness that could be exploited, no gap in his defenses that an enemy could use to bring him down. Only the Emperor himself, wielding the full might of his psychic power, in a moment of absolute determination, could finally end the threat that Horus represented. The unconquerable spirits, powers beyond the physical. We have spoken at length about physical strength, martial skill, and psychic power. But the Primarchs possessed abilities that transcended these categories, talents so unique and so extraordinary that they defied easy classification. These were the brothers whose gifts made them not merely powerful, but fundamentally different from the others. Beings whose very nature bent the rules of reality in ways that even the Emperor may not have fully intended. We have already touched upon Vulcan's perpetual nature, but it bears deeper examination in this context. Among all the Primarchs, Vulcan was the only one explicitly designated as a true perpetual, a being gifted with the complete version of the immortality that the Emperor himself possessed. While all Primarchs had extraordinary healing abilities, and while several possessed longevity that extended their lives far beyond normal human spans, only Vulcan could regenerate from complete and total destruction. He could be vaporized, reduced to his component atoms, and he would still eventually reconstitute himself and return to life. The only known weakness to this ability was the fulgurite, a petrified bolt of the Emperor's own psychic energy, and even a direct strike from this weapon did not permanently kill Vulcan. It merely killed his perpetual nature temporarily before he was eventually restored. The strategic implications of true immortality in a galaxy of eternal war are staggering. Vulcan could take risks that no other Primarch would dare, and could engage enemies and endure conditions that would be suicide for anyone else, knowing that even the worst possible outcome would be temporary. During the War of the Beast, thousands of years after the Horus heresy, Vulcan appeared on Terra itself, seemingly out of place in a time that considered the Primarchs figures of barely understood myth. He eventually destroyed the beast, the most powerful orc warlord the galaxy had ever produced, by detonating himself and his enemy together. And even this was not enough to end him permanently, as his perpetual nature all but guaranteed his eventual return. Conrad Curzy, the Night Haunter, Primarch of the Night Lords, possessed a different kind of extraordinary ability, one that made him terrifying in an entirely different way. Kurz was gifted with precognition, the ability to see possible futures. But where Sanguinius's visions showed him the brightest paths, the best possible outcomes, Kurz's visions showed him only darkness. Yet he saw the worst that could happen, the most terrible outcomes, the blood and suffering and death that awaited at the end of every road. This constant exposure to visions of horror and despair drove Curzy to the edge of madness and beyond, shaping him into a being of such terrible cruelty that even his brothers feared him. But Curzy's precognition also made him an extraordinarily dangerous combatant. He could see attacks coming before they were launched. He could predict the movements of his enemies with uncanny accuracy, could position himself with perfect precision to exploit openings that others could not see. Combined with his exceptional stealth capabilities and his ability to operate flawlessly in total darkness, this made Curzy one of the most difficult Primarchs to fight in single combat. Even the Lion, one of the supreme duelists among the brothers, have found Kurz to be a slippery and dangerous opponent who could not be pinned down or cornered. Corvus Corax, the Primarch of the Raven Guard, possessed what may be the most visually dramatic of all the Primarch abilities: shadow walking. Corax could make himself essentially invisible, not through technology or camouflage, but through a psychic ability that erased his presence from the perception of others. People would look directly at him and see nothing, or their eyes would slide off him as if he simply did not exist. This was not mere stealth or hiding. It was a fundamental manipulation of how other beings perceived reality, a psychic cloak that made Corax into a ghost that could move through enemy lines undetected, striking from nowhere with devastating force before vanishing back into the shadows. After the Horus heresy, Corax's abilities evolved in terrifying directions. He retreated into the Eye of Terror, and pursuing the traitorous Lorgar into the heart of chaos itself. There, exposed to the raw power of the warp, Corax's shadow-walking ability transformed him into something that was barely recognizable as a Primarch. He became a creature of living darkness, a predator that existed partially in the warp and partially in reality, his form shifting and changing as he hunted his prey through the nightmarish landscapes of the Eye. Lorgar, the Primarch, who had engineered the downfall of the Imperium through his worship of the Chaos Gods, reportedly locked himself in a tower on his demon world and refused to come out for millennia. So terrified was he of what his brother had become. Mortarion, the Primarch of the Death Guard, possessed extreme physical resilience that went beyond even the remarkable durability of his brothers. Raised on the toxic death world of Barbarous, where the very atmosphere was poison and the ground seeped with chemical death, Mortarion developed an almost supernatural resistance to toxins, diseases, and environmental hazards. He could breathe gases that would dissolve the lungs of a space marine. He could wade through chemical spills that would eat through ceramite armor. He was, in essence, immune to almost every form of biological and chemical warfare that existed. And this resilience became even more extreme after Mortarion's transformation into a demon prince of Nurgle, the Plague God. In this form, Mortarion became a walking embodiment of disease and decay, surrounded by a cloud of pestilence that could fell entire armies. His body was virtually indestructible, capable of shrugging off wounds that would have killed any other Primarch, his Nurgle-blessed constitution allowing him to fight on through damage that should have been instantly fatal. As a Daemon Primarch, Mortarion was one of the most durable beings in the galaxy, a wall of diseased flesh and corroded armor that could absorb punishment that would destroy a Titan and keep fighting. Alpharius and Omegon, the twin Primarchs of the Alpha Legion, possessed an ability that was unique among all the brothers and utterly baffling to everyone who encountered it. They could perfectly impersonate each other, and more remarkably, their Alpha Legion Astartes could be surgically and psychically altered to impersonate them in turn. This meant that at any given time, there could be dozens of individuals claiming to be Alpharius, each one indistinguishable from the real thing. The twins used this ability to wage a form of warfare that was entirely unique among the legions, a style based on deception, misdirection, and the strategic sowing of confusion that made the Alpha Legion the most unpredictable and difficult to counter of all the Space Marine legions. The twin Primarchs were not the strongest in raw physical terms, and they were not the most skilled warriors, but their ability to be anywhere and everywhere simultaneously, to appear where they were not expected and to vanish from where they were anticipated, made them extraordinarily difficult to defeat. Even Rogel Dawn, as one of the most formidable warriors and strategists among the Primarchs, was reportedly driven to distraction by his inability to pin down the Alpha Legion's true leadership or predict their next move. The twins represented a kind of power that was not about strength or speed or psychic might, but about information, about control, about the ability to shape the battlefield before a single shot was fired. Count the strategists and builders, power beyond the battlefield. Not all strength is measured in the crash of weapons or the roar of psychic fire. Some of the most powerful Primarchs exercised their dominance not through combat, but through the force of their intellect, the brilliance of their strategies, and their ability to build and sustain civilizations that could endure for millennia. These were the brothers who understood that winning a battle was meaningless if you lost the war. That true power lay not in destruction, but in creation. Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines and current Lord Commander of the Imperium, is perhaps the finest example of this principle. Guilliman was not the strongest Primarch in combat. He was not the fastest, the most skilled with a blade, or the most psychically gifted. But he was arguably the most complete leader, a being whose gifts encompassed not merely warfare but governance, logistics, diplomacy, and the 1,000 other disciplines necessary to maintain a galaxy-spanning civilization. Raised on Macragge, Guilliman displayed his extraordinary abilities from an early age, growing into the greatest warrior, strategist, and statesman the planet had ever produced. By the time the Emperor arrived to reclaim his lost son, Guilliman had already transformed Macragge from a collection of warring fiefdoms into a prosperous, well-ordered society with a strong military and active interplanetary trade. He had accomplished in a few years what most rulers could not achieve in a lifetime, and he had done it while simultaneously serving as the planet's greatest warrior. During the Great Crusade, the Ultramarines under Guilliman conquered more worlds and conquered them faster than any other legion save the Lunar Wolves. But what truly set Guilliman apart was what happened after the conquest, where other legions moved on to the next fight, leaving chaos and disruption in their wake. And the Ultramarines established functioning governments, efficient bureaucracies, and sustainable economies on every world they brought into compliance. Guilliman did not merely conquer, he built. And the civilization he built in Ultramar endured for 10,000 years, becoming one of the few beacons of relative prosperity and stability in the nightmare of the 41st millennium. In the current era, Guilliman wields the Emperor's sword, a weapon imbued with a portion of the master of mankind's own psychic power. This blade burns with sacred fire and can cleave through the thickest armor, capable of destroying even demonic entities that would be invulnerable to conventional weaponry. Combined with the armor of fate, a masterwork of the Mechanicum's finest artificers that both sustains his life force and provides extraordinary protection, Guilliman is one of the most formidable warriors in the current Imperium. His confrontation with the demon Primarch Magnus on Luna demonstrated that even against the most powerful psyker among his brothers, Guilliman could hold his ground and eventually prevail with the right support. But Guilliman's true power lies not in his combat abilities, but in his mind. He authored the Codex Astartes, the document that reformed the Space Marine legions into the chapters that exist in the present day, and a work of military science so comprehensive and so brilliant that it has guided the Imperium's warriors for 10,000 years. He established the administrative structures that allowed the Imperium to function in the Emperor's absence, creating systems of governance and logistics that, while imperfect and often corrupted over the millennia, still represent the backbone of human civilization in the 41st millennium. And upon his resurrection, he launched the Indomitus Crusade, as the largest military operation the Imperium had undertaken since the Great Crusade itself, driving back the forces of chaos and establishing the Primaris Space Marines as the new defenders of humanity. Rogel Dawn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists, exercised a different kind of strategic power. Dawn was the master of defensive warfare, a genius of fortification whose abilities were so extraordinary that the Emperor entrusted him with the defense of Terra itself during the Horus heresy. The fortifications that Dawn designed for the Imperial Palace were so formidable that even the combined might of 9 traitor legions, supported by demonic allies and Titan legions, could not breach them. The siege of Terra lasted for months, with the traitors hurling everything they had against Dawn's defenses, and still they held. Dawn was also a formidable warrior in his own right. He slew Alpharius, one of the twin Primarchs of the Alpha Legion, in single combat, as a feat that demonstrated both his martial skill and his ability to see through the deceptions and misdirections for which the Alpha Legion was famous. He was wounded by Fulgrim during the heresy and continued to fight, his iron will and physical resilience allowing him to endure injuries that would have incapacitated lesser warriors. In many ways, Dawn embodied the Imperial Fist's ethos of stubborn, unyielding resistance, a wall of determination and skill that could not be broken by force alone. But Perturabo, the Primarch of the Iron Warriors, was Dawn's dark mirror, a master of siege warfare who specialized not in defense but in offense. Where Dawn built walls that could withstand anything, Perturabo designed strategies and weapons that could tear those walls down. The rivalry between these two brothers was legendary, each one driven to prove his superiority over the other, each one producing works of military engineering that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Perturabo could make technological machinery go haywire with his mere presence, a unique ability that suggested a form of techno-empathy or techno-manipulation that no other Primarch possessed. He could see into the warp like a navigator, perceiving the currents of the Imperium with a clarity that others lacked. And his strategic mind was such that he could analyze a fortress or defensive position and identify its weaknesses with almost supernatural precision, a talent that made him the most feared siege master in the galaxy. Jagatai Khan brought a different kind of strategic brilliance to the table. Where Guilliman planned for centuries and Dawn built for millennia, the Khan planned for seconds. His genius lay in speed, in the ability to see and exploit fleeting opportunities that others would miss, in the capacity to move faster and strike harder than any enemy could anticipate. The White Scars under his command were the masters of lightning warfare, striking with devastating force at the most vulnerable points of an enemy's position before withdrawing before a counterattack could be mounted. The Khan was also more philosophical than many of his brothers, possessing a depth of spiritual insight that set him apart from the pragmatists and strategists who dominated the Brotherhood. But he understood that war was not merely a contest of arms, but a clash of wills and ideologies, and he approached each engagement with a holistic understanding that encompassed not merely the tactical situation, but the broader cultural and spiritual context in which the fighting took place. This wisdom made him one of the most effective peacekeepers among the Primarchs, capable of resolving conflicts through understanding and respect, as well as through force. But the Khan's speed was not merely a physical attribute, but a philosophical one. He believed in freedom above all else, in the open sky and the rushing wind and the thrill of the hunt. His White Scars reflected this ethos, fighting with a joyful aggression that stood in stark contrast to the grim determination of many other legions. In combat, the Khan was a blur of motion, his curved blade tracing arcs of destruction through enemy ranks with the fluid grace of a calligraphy brush, painting characters on silk. His enemies rarely saw him coming, and those who did rarely had time to react before his blade found its mark. During the heresy, the Khan's speed proved decisive on multiple occasions. He fought through the webway itself during the battles around the White Scars fleet, demonstrating that his abilities extended beyond the merely physical. He confronted demonic entities and traitor forces with equal aplomb, his lightning-fast combat style proving just as effective against supernatural opponents as it was against mortal ones. And when the Siege of Terror began, it was the Khan who led one of the most devastating counterattacks in the history of the Imperium, his White Scars breaking through the traitor lines with such speed and fury that even the forces of chaos were caught off guard. Well, what makes the Strategist Primarchs so fascinating in the context of this discussion is the way they redefine our understanding of strength. We tend to think of power in physical terms, in the ability to destroy, to overcome, to dominate through force. But the Primarchs who excelled in strategy and governance wielded a different kind of power, one that was in many ways more durable and more impactful than any amount of physical might. Ketar Guilliman's Codex Astartes has shaped the Imperium's military for 10,000 years. Dawn's fortifications on Terra saved humanity from extinction. The Khan's philosophy of speed and freedom influenced not just his legion, but the entire imperial military doctrine. These contributions did not merely win battles, they shaped the destiny of the species. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of the Strategist Primarchs. That true strength is not merely the ability to destroy, but the ability to build, to create, to establish something that endures long after the warrior who built it has fallen silent. In a galaxy defined by endless war and constant destruction, the ability to create something lasting is the rarest and most precious form of power there is. The weapons of the demigods. Tools fit for gods. Before we move on to measuring the Primarchs against the other great powers of the galaxy, we need to spend some time discussing the weapons and armor that these beings carried into battle. Because a Primarch was already a weapon of almost incomprehensible power, but armed with the master-crafted relics and artifacts that were forged specifically for their use, their capabilities were elevated to an entirely different level. Every Primarch possessed weapons that were, quite literally, the finest ever created by human hands. These were not mass-produced implements of war, and each one was a unique masterwork, forged by the greatest smiths in the Imperium, using materials and techniques that were often barely understood by anyone other than their creators. Some were gifts from the Emperor himself. Others were forged by the Primarch's own hands, products of their superhuman skill and creativity. And still others were artifacts of such ancient provenance that their origins were lost in the mists of prehistory. Vulcan's Dawnbringer, for example, where it was a colossal warhammer so massive that no being but a Primarch could hope to lift it. Supposedly crafted from indestructible materials, it could sunder anything that stood against it, its every strike carrying the force of a controlled demolition. But Dawnbringer was more than just a weapon. It possessed a built-in teleporter, allowing Vulcan to instantly travel vast distances, even to faraway planets. This combination of devastating striking power and tactical mobility made Dawnbringer one of the most versatile weapons in the Primarch's collective arsenal. The Emperor's sword, now wielded by Guilliman, deserves special mention as perhaps the most significant weapon in the entire Imperium. This blade was carried by the Emperor himself during the Great Crusade and the Horus heresy, and imbued with a portion of his psychic might that made it effective against entities that would be invulnerable to conventional weaponry. When Guilliman swings this sword, it burns with sacred fire, each stroke carrying not just the Primarch's considerable physical strength, but the Emperor's own divine wrath. It is this weapon that allowed Guilliman to wound Nurgle in the plague god's own garden, a feat that would be impossible with any mundane blade. Angron's weapons tell their own tragic story. Gorefather and Gorechild were a pair of chain axes, massive weapons whose grinding teeth could tear through anything they touched. These weapons were extensions of Angron's fury, their constant revving growl a mechanical echo of the rage that burned within their master's tortured mind. When Gorefather was broken during the fighting at Istvan, Angron discarded it in disgust, and his equerry Khan picked up the weapon and carried it into battle himself. Thus the chain axe became one of the most iconic weapons in the World Eater's arsenal, a symbol of the Legion's descent into mindless violence. Sanguinius carried the blade Encarmine, an ornate power sword that responded only to those who possessed his genetic code, and the spear of Telesto, a weapon capable of firing blasts of energy that would vaporize anyone who did not carry the blood of the angel in their veins. These weapons were not merely powerful but deeply personal, as extensions of Sanguinius's very essence that could not be wielded by anyone else. The Moonsilver Blade, a secondary sword used against demonic opponents, was built from the same alloy as the frame of the Phalanx, the Imperial Fist's colossal mobile fortress, and was particularly effective against creatures of the Warp. Magnus the Red's weapons were as unconventional as the Crimson King himself. His blade of Arn Nunurta, a force weapon shaped like the weapon of the Prosperine war god of ancient myth, combined ancient lore with Imperial weapons technology to create something equally lethal to living creatures and battle engines alike. His Sapphire Serpenta, described as a powerful plasma weapon, was so deeply connected to Magnus's psychic abilities that there was ongoing debate among his own legion about whether it was truly a physical device or simply a manifestation of the Primarch's power given temporary form, conjured into his grasp whenever he needed it and vanishing when he did not. The Talon of Horus, wielded by the Warmaster during the heresy, was one of the most devastating melee weapons ever created. This massive lightning claw could tear through the thickest armor with contemptuous ease, its energy field disintegrating matter at the molecular level. Combined with Worldbreaker, a colossal mace whose strikes carried the force of a demolition charge, as these weapons made Horus a nightmare in close quarters. After Horus's death, the Talon was recovered by Abaddon the Despoiler, who continued to wield it for the next 10,000 years as the symbol of his authority over the Black Legion. Leman Russ carried weapons that reflected his savage nature. The Sword of Balanite and the Axe Hellwinter were fearsome weapons in their own right, but it was the Spear of Russ, also known as Gungnir, that was his most significant armament. This weapon, gifted to him by the Emperor, possessed the power to cleanse chaos corruption, a property that was demonstrated when Russ plunged it into Horus's side during their duel. The wound temporarily restored Horus to his pre-corruption state, giving Russ a glimpse of the brother he had lost. The fact that a weapon could, even temporarily, overcome the combined blessings of all four chaos gods speaks to the extraordinary power that the Emperor had imbued into it. And Lionel Johnson now carries the sword Fealty and the Emperor's shield, artifacts of such power that they mark him as one of the most formidable warriors in the current Imperium. Fealty is a massive blade whose strikes carry an almost supernatural weight, each blow calculated to destroy with maximum efficiency. The Emperor's shield provides protection that transcends the merely physical, a barrier against both mundane and supernatural threats that makes the lion extraordinarily difficult to harm. Together, these weapons transform the already formidable first Primarch into something approaching the unstoppable. The armor worn by the Primarchs was equally extraordinary. Each suit was a unique masterwork, designed to protect its wearer against weapons capable of destroying vehicles and fortifications. The horned raiment worn by Magnus was described as being as much a thing of tangible psychic force and imperial energy as it was a physical construction, arms shifting its form and appearance according to the Primarch's will. Despite its often primitive appearance, it could protect against the most savage of weapons, its true defensive properties operating on the psychic plane rather than the physical. Guilliman's Armor of Fate, crafted by the finest artisans of the Mechanicum on orders from Archmagos Belisarius Call, not only provides extraordinary protection but actively sustains the Primarch's life force, keeping him alive through wounds that would otherwise be fatal. It is this armor that allows Guilliman to function despite the mortal wounds he received at the Battle of Thessalar, wounds that 10,000 years of stasis had not fully healed. Horus's serpent scales, his personal suit of Terminator armor, was heavily modified and bore serpent motifs that reflected both his legion's iconography and the corruption that had taken root in his soul. This armor was so formidable that even Sanguinius, who was one of the greatest warriors among the Primarchs, could barely scratch it during their final duel. The small crack that the angel managed to create in Horus's armor became legendary, as it was through this tiny breach that the Emperor was eventually able to strike the killing blow that ended the War Master's existence. Ferrus Manus wielded Forgebreaker, a warhammer of such devastating power that it could crush Titan armor to paste. Whilst this weapon was originally crafted by Fulgrim and gifted to Ferrus as a token of brotherhood, making it one of the most tragically ironic artifacts in the Warhammer canon, given that Fulgrim would later slay the very brother he had made it for. After Ferrus's death, Forgebreaker passed into the hands of Perturabo, who wielded it throughout the remainder of the heresy. The hammer became a symbol of the broken bonds between brothers, a weapon forged in friendship and stained forever by betrayal. Yes, these weapons and armors were not merely equipment. They were extensions of the Primarchs themselves, artifacts that amplified and focused their already extraordinary abilities into concentrated instruments of destruction and protection. A Primarch without his weapons was still one of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy, but a Primarch armed with his full panoply of war was something that approached the sublime in its destructive potential, a walking cataclysm wrapped in ceramite and gold, and carrying the accumulated power of the greatest civilization humanity had ever built. Primarchs against the galaxy, measuring the immeasurable. Now that we have examined the Primarchs individually, let us step back and place them in the broader context of the Warhammer galaxy, because the true measure of their strength lies not merely in what they could do to each other, but in how they compared to the other great powers of the 41st Millennium. When a Primarch walked onto a battlefield, what did that mean for the creatures and war machines that opposed them? Let us begin with the most basic comparison, a Primarch versus a Space Marine. The Adeptus Astartes are often described as the greatest warriors in the galaxy, superhuman soldiers whose capabilities far exceed anything that a normal human could achieve. A single Space Marine can fight for weeks without rest. he can shrug off wounds that would kill an ordinary soldier a dozen times over. When he can process information faster than any unaugmented human, react to threats with superhuman speed, and deliver strikes with enough force to punch through armor plating. Space Marines are, by any reasonable standard, among the most formidable individual warriors in the galaxy, and to a Primarch, they are barely more than a nuisance. The gap between a Space Marine and a Primarch is so vast that direct comparison almost feels insulting. As Guilliman punched through Space Marine armor with his bare hands, Angron could wade through formations of Astartes like a farmer harvesting wheat, each swing of his chain axes claiming multiple lives. A Primarch could engage and destroy an entire squad of Space Marines without breaking stride, and some of the more powerful brothers could engage entire companies without being seriously threatened. The comparison with Titans is more revealing. Titans are the greatest war machines of the Imperium, yet walking fortresses of such immense size and firepower that they can level cities and dominate entire battlefields. A Warlord-class Titan stands over 30 meters tall, armed with weapons capable of destroying entire regiments in a single volley. And yet, the Primarchs were capable of engaging these colossal machines on roughly equal terms. Sanguinius beheaded a Reaver Titan during the Siege of Terra, cutting through its armored neck with his blade. A Angron stopped a Warhound Titan's foot with his bare hands. Magnus could vaporize Titans with his psychic power. The fact that beings who stood roughly 3 meters tall could challenge and defeat war machines 10 times their size speaks to the extraordinary nature of the power they wielded. Demons present another useful point of comparison. Greater demons, the most powerful servants of the Chaos Gods, are among the most terrifying entities in the Warhammer universe. A bloodthirster of Horn can slaughter entire armies. A Lord of Change can manipulate the fabric of reality itself. A Great Unclean One can spread plagues that consume whole worlds. These are beings of immense supernatural power, creatures that exist partially outside the laws of physics and can draw upon the infinite energy of the warp to fuel their attacks. And the Primarchs fought them, and won. Sanguinius defeated Kabanda, one of the mightiest bloodthirsters in Khorne's legions, while breaking the demon's back over his knee. Lorgar, widely considered the weakest Primarch in combat terms, defeated Angrath, another tremendously powerful bloodthirster. The lion faced demonic entities during the heresy and prevailed through a combination of martial skill and his innate ability to sense warp entities. Was the fact that Primarchs could engage greater demons in single combat and emerge victorious places them firmly in the category of the most powerful individual beings in the galaxy. The Elder present another interesting comparison. The ancient Elder race had warriors of extraordinary skill and technology, of breathtaking sophistication, including avatars of Kain, physical manifestations of their war god, that were among the most formidable combatants the galaxy had ever seen. These living statues of molten metal and divine fury could wade through entire Space Marine companies and emerge unscathed. And yet, Primarchs defeated them. At least one Primarch, though accounts vary on who, strangled an avatar of Cain to death with his bare hands, physically beating the incarnation of a god into submission through nothing but raw strength and determination. The Greenskins, or those endless tides of savage alien warriors whose combined biomass probably exceeds that of any other species in the galaxy, also serve as a useful measuring stick. An Orc warboss is a creature of immense size and strength, a natural-born killer who has risen to dominance through a lifetime of brutal combat. The largest warbosses can match or exceed a Space Marine in raw physical power. But against a Primarch, even the greatest warboss would be little more than a speed bump. Vulcan destroyed the Beast, the most powerful Orc the galaxy had ever produced, a creature that commanded a green-skinned civilization capable of threatening Terra itself. The fact that a single Primarch could achieve what entire Crusade fleets had failed to accomplish speaks volumes about the scale of power these beings operated on. The Necrons provide yet another fascinating point of comparison. These ancient robotic beings possess technology so advanced that it makes the Imperium's finest achievements look like Stone Age tools. Necron lords can rearrange three-dimensional space so that attacks cannot intersect with their bodies. Necron overlords can command scarabs that consume entire planets. Their weapons operate on principles of molecular disintegration that ignore conventional armor entirely. Even a Primarch would need to take a Necron lord seriously, and the Silent King, as supreme ruler of the entire Necron race, is considered powerful enough to pose a significant threat to any individual Primarch. The fact that the Necrons represent one of the few factions in the galaxy that could challenge a Primarch on roughly equal terms speaks to the extraordinary level of power that these ancient beings operate on. The Tyranids, those endless swarms of alien bioforms that consume entire worlds, present a different kind of challenge. No individual Tyranid creature, save perhaps the largest bio-titans, can match a Primarch in single combat. But the Tyranids do not fight as individuals. They fight as a single organism, a hive mind of billions of creatures directed by a consciousness of staggering complexity. Against such an enemy, even a Primarch's extraordinary combat abilities are limited by simple mathematics. You can only kill so many enemies at once, no matter how strong or fast you are. As the Tyranid threat demonstrates the limits of individual power in a galaxy of infinite threats, a reminder that even demigods can be overwhelmed by sufficient numbers. Perhaps the most revealing comparison of all is with the Chaos Gods themselves. When Guilliman, armed with the Emperor's sword, confronted Nurgle in the Garden of the Plague God during the Plague Wars, he was able to wound the Chaos God and burn a significant portion of its domain. Let that sink in for a moment. Nurgle is a god, a being of infinite power that exists beyond the boundaries of mortal comprehension, an entity that has existed since the dawn of sentient life and will endure until the last thinking creature in the galaxy draws its final breath. And a single Primarch armed with the right weapon was able to harm it. This does not make Guilliman more powerful than a Chaos God. The circumstances were unique, and the weapon he wielded carried the Emperor's own psychic essence. But it does demonstrate that Primarchs operated on a scale of power that approached the divine, that they existed in a space between the mortal and the godlike, that no other beings in the galaxy could claim. The Custodians, the Emperor's personal bodyguard, provide perhaps the most useful comparison for understanding exactly where the Primarchs sit in the hierarchy of power. Custodians are individually superior to Space Marines in every measurable way. They are stronger, faster, more durable, and more skilled and more intelligent. A single Custodian can defeat multiple Space Marines in combat. They are the finest warriors that humanity can produce, short of the Primarchs themselves. And yet, even the greatest Custodian is vastly inferior to even the weakest Primarch. Constantine Valdor, the Captain General of the Custodian Guard, and perhaps the single most formidable non-Primarch warrior in the Imperium. It was challenged by Primarchs, but could not have defeated any of them in a straight fight. The gap between the greatest Custodian and the weakest Primarch is comparable to the gap between a skilled mortal warrior and a Space Marine. It is a gulf that skill and determination alone cannot bridge. This hierarchy of power, mortal to Space Marine to Custodian to Primarch to Emperor, is one of the defining features of the Warhammer universe. Each level represents a quantum leap in capability that makes the previous level almost irrelevant by comparison. And the Primarchs occupy the second highest tier, beings of such extraordinary power that they dwarf everything below them, and can challenge, if not equal, the divine entities that sit above them. This is the scale on which the Emperor's sons operate, and it is a scale that makes them the most significant individual actors in a galaxy of trillions. The comparison between Primarchs also reveals fascinating dynamics about how different types of power interact. A Primarch who excels in raw physical strength might be defeated by one who excels in martial skill, who in turn might be outmatched by one with overwhelming psychic power, who might in turn be vulnerable to one with natural resistance to sorcery. But the interplay between these different forms of power creates a complex web of matchups and rivalries that has fueled debate among fans for decades. Can Magnus defeat Russ if the Wolf King cannot resist his psychic attacks? Can Russ defeat Magnus if the Crimson King's sorcery fails against his innate resistance? Can either of them defeat Sanguinius, whose precognition allows him to anticipate their every move? These questions have no definitive answers. And that ambiguity is part of what makes the Primarchs so endlessly fascinating. What is clear is that no single Primarch was intended to be universally supreme. The Emperor designed each of his sons to excel in a different domain, to complement and balance each other's strengths and weaknesses. Together, the 20 Primarchs represented a complete spectrum of capability that could address any threat the galaxy might produce. Divided as they were by the Horus heresy, they became the instruments of the galaxy's greatest catastrophe. This duality, the fact that the same beings who could save the galaxy could also destroy it, is the essential tragedy at the heart of the Warhammer universe. And it is a tragedy that continues to unfold 10,000 years after the heresy first tore the Imperium apart. Shout the bonds that break worlds, Primarch rivalries and legendary duels. No exploration of the Primarch's strength would be complete without examining the moments when these demigods turned their power against each other. Because while it is impressive to know that a Primarch can defeat a Titan or banish a greater demon, it is in the duels between brothers that we truly see the limits of their power tested, pushed, and sometimes exceeded. What the duel between Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim at the Dropsite Massacre on Istvan V is one of the most emotionally devastating moments in the entire Horus heresy. These two brothers had been close friends, bonded by their shared love of craftsmanship and their mutual respect for each other's abilities. Ferrus had forged the sword Fireblade for Fulgrim, while Fulgrim had crafted the hammer Forgebreaker for Ferrus. They had exchanged these gifts as tokens of brotherhood, or symbols of an unbreakable bond. And then that bond was shattered. When the Dropsite Massacre began and Fulgrim's treachery was revealed, Ferrus charged toward his former brother with a fury born of betrayal and heartbreak. Their duel was titanic, their master-crafted weapons releasing energies that illuminated the battlefield for hundreds of meters. The lore describes their blows as carrying the strength to defeat armies and topple mountains. Each strike a cataclysm in miniature, each parry sending shockwaves across the killing ground. Both warriors fought with the hatred that only brothers divided can muster, their armor dented, torn, and blackened by the fury of their conflict. In the end, Fulgrim's corruption gave him the edge he needed. Ferrus hesitated at the crucial moment, unable to bring himself to strike the killing blow against a brother he still loved despite everything. Fulgrim did not hesitate. He took Ferrus's head, and in doing so, became the first Primarch to slay another. The image of Fulgrim, holding his brother's severed head aloft, is one of the most iconic and disturbing images in the entire Warhammer canon, a symbol of everything the heresy destroyed. The rivalry between Rogal Dorn and Perturabo provides a different kind of drama. These two brothers were mirrors of each other, each a master of siege warfare, each convinced of his own superiority. Dorn built the greatest fortifications the Imperium had ever seen, while Perturabo developed strategies and weapons that could tear those fortifications apart. Their competition drove both of them to ever greater heights of military engineering, each one pushing the boundaries of what was possible in order to surpass his rival. When Perturabo turned traitor and joined Horus, this rivalry took on a new and terrible dimension. The Siege of Terror became, in many ways, a personal contest between the two brothers, with Dorn defending and Perturabo attacking, and each one deploying their greatest works against the other. That Dorn's defenses held, that the Imperial Palace did not fall despite the combined assault of 9 traitor legions, is a testament to the Imperial Fist's engineering genius. But Perturabo's attacks came agonizingly close to breaking through, demonstrating that the Iron Warrior was every bit Dorn's equal in the art of war. The Night of the Wolf, the confrontation between Leman Russ and Angron, it is another legendary moment in Primarch history. The Emperor had sent Russ to bring Angron to heel, to convince or compel the Red Angel to stop implanting his legion with the Butcher's nails. What followed was not a duel, but a battle. as the Space Wolves and World Eaters clashed in a bloody melee that neither side would ever forget. Russ and Angron fought at the heart of this maelstrom, the Wolf King's tactical cunning pitted against the Red Angel's berserker fury. The fight was inconclusive in a strictly military sense, with both legions claiming victory and both harboring the secret fear that they had actually lost. But it demonstrated something important about the nature of Primarch combat. Raw power alone was not enough to guarantee victory. Angron was arguably the stronger of the two in purely physical terms, but Russ's tactical acumen and fighting skill kept the contest close. As the confrontation between Corax and Lorgar at the Dropsite Massacre provides yet another fascinating data point. Lorgar, widely considered the weakest Primarch in combat, was caught in the open by Corax, the shadow-walking Primarch of the Raven Guard. What followed was less a duel and more a beating, with Corax savaging Lorgar with a ferocity born of rage and betrayal. Lorgar was only saved by the intervention of Conrad Kersey, who engaged Corax in a fight that was far more evenly matched. This sequence of events perfectly illustrates the spectrum of combat ability among the Primarchs. Lorgar, for all his other gifts, was simply outclassed in physical combat, while Kersey, operating in his element of darkness and terror, was capable of matching even the most dangerous of his brothers. The legacy and the future. Primarchs returned, and Primarchs yet to come. As we bring this exploration to a close, we must look at where the Primarchs stand in the current era of Warhammer and what their power means for the galaxy's future. Because after 10,000 years of absence, after an age of darkness in which the Imperium slowly crumbled under the weight of its own decay, the Primarchs are coming back. And their return changes everything. Robert Guilliman was the first to return. Resurrected from his near death at the Battle of Thessala through the combined efforts of the Archmagos Belisarius Call and the Elder God Inead. Armed with the Emperor's sword and the armor of fate, Guilliman launched the Indomitus Crusade, the largest military operation the Imperium had undertaken in 10,000 years, driving back the forces of chaos and bringing hope to a galaxy that had all but given up on salvation. His return demonstrated that even a single Primarch could shift the balance of power in a galaxy-spanning conflict, that the mere presence of one of these demigods was enough to transform a losing war into a fighting chance. Lion L. Johnson followed, awakening from his 10,000-year slumber within the rock, the Dark Angel's mobile fortress monastery. The Lion returned to a galaxy he barely recognized, a nightmarish parody of the Imperium he had fought to build. But the first Primarch did not falter. Armed with the sword, fealty, and the Emperor's shield, he set out to carve a path of destruction through the enemies of humanity, stalking from world to world like the questing knight of legend, his arrival heralded by visions of ancient forests fading from the ether. His confrontation with the demon Primarch Angron demonstrated that even after 10 millennia of rest, the Lion's combat abilities were as sharp and deadly as they had ever been. On the other side of the line, the traitor Primarchs have also been stirring. Mortarion leads the Death Guard from his plague-ridden demon world, spreading Nurgle's gifts across the galaxy, with a fervor born of millennia of service to the Plague God. Magnus the Red plots and schemes from the planet of the sorcerers, his psychic might growing ever greater as he draws upon the power of Sench. Angron rampages across the Imperium, his demonic fury unchecked by the constraints that once bound his mortal form. And Fulgrim, newly returned with a stunning model that brings the demon Primarch of Slaanesh to life in all his serpentine glory, adds yet another terrifying presence to the forces of chaos. The stage is being set for a confrontation that dwarfs even the Horus heresy. Loyalist Primarchs are awakening and returning to the fight, while demon Primarchs consolidate their power and prepare for a final assault. As the missing brothers, Leman Russ, Jagatai Khan, Corvus Corax, Vulcan, Rogel Dawn if he yet lives, remain out there somewhere, lost in the warp or the shadows or the vast emptiness between the stars. Each one represents a potential game changer, a being of such extraordinary power that their return could tip the balance of the entire galaxy. And this brings us to the fundamental answer to the question we posed at the beginning of this journey. Just how strong are the Primarchs? The answer is that they are strong enough to matter on a galactic scale, strong enough to fight gods and wound them, strong enough to topple titans and shatter demon lords, strong enough to command the loyalty of billions and reshape the destiny of entire civilizations, strong enough to endure for 10,000 years and return to a galaxy that desperately needs them, strong enough to carry the hopes and fears of all humanity upon their shoulders, and sometimes you're strong enough to bear that weight. They are the Emperor's sons. They are the greatest warriors, the greatest strategists, the greatest builders, and the greatest destroyers that humanity has ever produced. They are beings of such extraordinary power that the word strength barely begins to describe them. They exist on a plane above mortals, above space marines, above titans and demons, and the horrors of the warp. They are, in the truest sense of the word, demigods, beings who straddle the boundary between the human and the divine and belong fully to neither world. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, where the laughter of thirsting gods echoes across the void, where 1,000,000 worlds burn beneath the light of dying stars, the Primarchs remain the brightest and most terrible flames of all. They are the proof that humanity can produce beings of godlike power. They are the promise that even in the darkest hour, there exists the potential for salvation. And they are the warning that even the greatest power, if misused, if corrupted, if turned against its intended purpose, can bring about the destruction of everything it was meant to protect. The Primarchs are strong enough to save the galaxy. They are strong enough to destroy it. And the question of which outcome ultimately prevails is the question that drives the entire Warhammer universe forward, one battle, one war, one apocalypse at a time. If you found this journey through the power of the Primarchs as fascinating as I found telling it, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. Every subscription helps us continue bringing you deep dives into the incredible lore of the 41st Millennium. Drop a comment below and let me know which Primarch you think is the most powerful, which returning brother you are most excited to see, and which Primarch's story deserves its own dedicated exploration. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember that in the grim darkness of the far future, knowledge is the most powerful weapon of all.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.